turn it to Todd for some of his insightful presentation. Thanks. Go ahead, Amber.
Thank you, Matt. Good afternoon. On behalf of Wheatland County Council, I'm thrilled to welcome everybody here today. And I'm so excited to hear from Todd, to hear your insights. I'm very grateful that you're taking this time to join us. I'm also incredibly thankful for our staff who have been organizing these collaborative calls. I think it's been helpful for me as a municipal councillor just to liaison with our businesses and do what we can to connect our businesses to different supports, and also just to hear the challenges, but also the success stories that I'm hearing. And that has just, it's been so exciting to see how our businesses have pivoted and found ways to not just be sustainable, but to thrive during kind of the intersection of several challenging situations, including the pandemic and the oil crisis and all of those things. So to see the success in our county, I'm really grateful for that. And welcome.
Thank you, Reeve Link. So quickly, our agenda today will be a presentation from Todd, and then we'll get into some Q&A after about 20 to 30 minutes of presentation. And then if we have time, we'll do some round table discussion with our participants on what's been going on over the last week, any goals moving forward coming out of it. But first and foremost, we have Todd Hirsch presenting to us today. He is the Vice President and Chief Economist for ATB Financial. He holds a BA Honours in Economics from the University of Alberta and a Master's in Economics from the University of Calgary. For over 25 years, he has worked as an economist at numerous organizations, including the Canadian Pacific Railway, the Canada West Foundation, and the Bank of Canada. Todd also taught economics at the University of Calgary for nearly a decade, both in the Department of Economics, as well as in the Department and the Faculty of Continuing Education. Todd has also been an instructor at the University of Alberta School of Business in Executive Education. He is also the author of 3 books. The latest book, Spiders in Space, Successfully Adapting to Unwanted Change, was released in 2017. As part of his role at ATB Financial, Todd speaks to hundreds of audiences across the country each year. He is a strong advocate in the arts and culture community, currently the board chair for the Calgary Arts Academy, and serves on the boards of the Glenbow Museum and the Alberta Ballet. Todd has been recognized as one of Alberta's most influential people. He's received the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal, the University of Alberta's Alumni Honours Award, and an honorary degree from Mount Royal University. Todd, we're thrilled to have you, and I'll turn it over to you now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Matthew. And everyone can see me and hear me, I'm hoping. If not, I'm getting a thumbs up, so that's good. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me, and to Patrick for inviting me to this. A real honor every time I get to speak to audiences throughout Alberta. And now that we're doing it virtually, I actually have the opportunity to, in fact, talk to a few more people in Alberta because I don't have to travel. So it would be nice to be with people in person, but there are some advantages to doing it all virtually. This is all very 2020 of us. So thank you for the opportunity to be on this webinar this afternoon. Before I start, I do want to just take a quick moment to acknowledge what is happening to our neighbor, with our neighbor to the south, with the uprisings and the protests and the Black Lives Matter. I think it's just important for all of us to pause and recognize this is not just America's problem. This happens in Canada too. There is racism, systemic racism in Canada. And I just think it's important that each one of us take a moment to identify where that racism might be and to stand up against racism in every form whenever we see it. So with that said, let's talk about Alberta's economy. Now, it seems like actually too nice of a day in June to ruin by talking about the economy. And you're pretty brave, in fact, for inviting an economist to ruin 30 minutes of your afternoon. But, you know, I think most of us understand how difficult the economic situation is. I think most of us have moved out of that, you know, the shock and awe of COVID-19 that we would have maybe experienced back in March and April when everything was shutting down. If you were like me, you may have experienced some real anxiety in late March and early April. not only because of the health risk and the pandemic itself, but also, just wondering what is going to happen to the economy. We were watching oil prices collapsing. We were watching stock markets collapsing. And I'll be frank, the last 2 weeks of March, I actually experienced a sense of professional anxiety that I had never experienced before. And that is, the minute COVID started to happen and the lockdown started to happen, my phone lit up and emails started coming in. Everyone wanted me to tell them what was going to happen. And I'm like, how the heck do I know what is going to happen? I actually kind of went into a dark hole for about a week and a half. And I just said, I'm not speaking right now because I didn't know what to say. But in April, we kind of worked our way through it, and most of us got past that initial shock. And now that we're into almost the middle of June, I think most of us realize we are in a different stage of the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic has certainly not gone away, and it is not going to go away for quite some time. But I think most of us, the shock and maybe the anxiety and the terror of it is behind us. And now I describe it as we are in an economy where we are learning to live with COVID-19. A lot of the same way, the parallels, if someone experiences a chronic illness or a disease, they often talk about they are living with that disease. Doesn't make it go away, and it doesn't, maybe make it any easier, but you keep going nonetheless. So now we are starting to see Alberta's economy gradually opening up. Some encouraging signs from our health minister and from Dr. Hinshaw that in fact we can accelerate some of the opening a little bit. More services and businesses allowed to open this Friday. So we are moving now into the summer months. We're living with COVID, but it raises a lot of questions. What does it mean going forward? And where do we go from here? There's been a lot of attention and a lot of focus on GDP forecasts. And, for the obvious reason, economists, we love trying to forecast what's going to happen to the GDP. And for most economists, when they give their forecast, the forecast for the GDP, that's kind of the punchline or the crescendo of the whole presentation. What's the forecast? And I've spent the last 25 years of my professional career trying to, at various points, trying to forecast, is the economy going to grow 3% or maybe 2.5%? And the range of, possibilities often seemed pretty narrow, maybe 1 or 2 percentage points. We used to quibble if it's going to be, 2% or 2.1% growth. Today, we are looking at a range that you could drive a truck through, as my colleague described it. And I'll talk about our range at the moment. We actually, my economics team at ATB, we have not yet officially gone public with trying to pinpoint a forecast. The only reason for that is, and I know all the other banks have done this and the conference board has done this, but we've made the decision not to make a big deal about releasing publicly our forecast only because that range is so enormous and we just don't feel it offers Albertans much value when we say the range is somewhere between -7 and -11%. We know it's going to be bad, and for most people, if it's -7 or -9 or -11, it really isn't going to mean that much of a difference. But we do know that this is the steepest one-year decline in our economy that any of us have ever seen. You do have to go all the way back to the Great Depression of the 1930s to experience something as deep a contraction. Now, it's possible some listeners on this webinar were alive during the Great Depression, but you probably weren't an adult unless we have some very, very senior citizens on the call. But most of us, we have this image in our mind of what life in Alberta was like during the 1930s. Most of us have seen photos or maybe heard stories, and it was a very terrible time. Images of people standing in soup lines and, in the dust bowl of the 30s, especially on the prairies, and, people going hungry and ragged clothes and all of these terrible, terrible images. And then fast forward to today, and you have economists like me saying it's going to be as deep a contraction as it was in the 1930s. And automatically in people's minds, they start to go to really dark places. thinking they're going to be standing barefoot in the dust, withering away from hunger. Now, I'm not expecting that. And for two very important reasons, I don't think life is going to be as difficult in 2020 as it was in 1933, which was really the depth of the Great Depression. The first reason is governments have responded in 2020 with immediate relief funds, governments around the world. That stands in sharp contrast to what happened in the 1930s. Back in 1930, when after the stock market crash of 1929 and the global economy went tumbling into recession in 1930, conventional thinking at that time, economic thinking, was the very best thing governments could do is in fact balance their own budgets. It was austerity. So governments in fact pulled back on spending. That was, at the time, that was what it was assumed that was the best thing to do. Now, with 90 years of learning on our side, we realize today that was the absolute worst thing governments could do. And in fact, it made the Great Depression go on much longer and much deeper than in fact it needed to. Today, and learning from experiences, for example, like in Japan, when they faced a financial crisis in 1990, the learning from that was they lost 20 years of growth in Japan because the government was really, really slow in responding to it with stimulus measures to sort of jumpstart the economy. And by the time they did finally jumpstart the economy, Japan was already trapped in this deflationary spiral. So fast forward to 2020, and today governments and economists have responded, well, with economists' advice, have responded exactly the opposite. They responded very immediately with all sorts of emergency measures, all sorts of stimulus, making sure that households and businesses are supported, at least in the short run. Now, we can get into, lots and lots of questions about, was it the right thing to do? Who's going to pay for all of this? Legitimate questions that we can maybe leave till the Q&A time. But those questions are going to be left for another time, probably in 2021. So we don't get out of this scot-free. There are consequences to the massive amounts of government spending we are seeing. But the metaphor I love using here is, when the house is on fire, you get the water hose, the fire hose, and you get as much, you just douse the house in water, douse the flames. You don't worry at that point about the furniture inside the house. If it's going to get damaged by the water, what happens to the flooring? Is it going to be ruined? There's a time and place for assessing the overall damage. But in the immediate present, it's important that you get those flames extinguished. And that's what governments have been doing at the onset of COVID-19. So, but we can get into the questions about how do we pay for this later. So that is the number one reason why, in fact, 2020 is not going to look like 1933. The other reason is sort of related, and that is central banks around the world have also responded. And central banks are different than governments. They are not, at least in Canada, they are not politically motivated. They have different agendas and different reasons for acting. But we have to remember, the Bank of Canada didn't even exist in 1933. It didn't come into existence until 1935. Again, fast forward to 2020, and central banks around the world, including the Bank of Canada, they too have responded with making sure that the financial system and the banking system is highly liquid. In other words, the last thing they want is a run on banks or people losing confidence in the financial system. So they have responded to make sure that liquidity is available to the financial system, sort of greasing the wheels of it and making sure it does not seize up. That is also very, very important because, again, what made the 1930s bad was runs on banks, people not being able to get money out of their banks. Everyone remembers the movie It's a Wonderful Life, the runs on banks, everyone flooding into a bank trying to get their money out. You don't want that happening. That makes everything worse. So in 2020, because central banks have responded by making sure that the financial system remain highly liquid and stable, we have seen no runs on banks, at least not to my knowledge. certainly not here in Canada. And to my knowledge, there has not even been any worry about the stability of global financial markets. Now, we can talk about what happened in equity markets and stock markets and volatility there. But just to sum up, government action, central bank action, responding very quickly. This is the difference between 1933 and 2020. So the contraction in our economy is going to be severe, but life for most Albertans is not going to be as bad as it was in 1933. The other question, more so than talking about the GDP, because for most of us, the GDP is kind of this abstract number, the size of the economy, how much it contracts. It generally doesn't connect too much emotionally with people, but what does connect emotionally with people is the job market. Are they going to have work? Are their kids coming out of school in the fall? Are they going to be able to find jobs? We heard the Premier back in March warning of 25% unemployment in Alberta. How bad is it going to get, and how long is that going to last? These are the kinds of questions that people, in fact, will lie awake at night, tossing and turning, particularly if they have lost their job. And that represents hundreds of thousands of Albertans at the moment. The official unemployment rate in Alberta for May, 15.5%. I'm going by memory, but I think that's what Stats Canada reported last Friday. That is a record high, at least records since they started keeping track in 1976. I'm sure if you do go back to 1933, it was even higher, but they don't have reliable numbers going back that far. So the labor force survey started in 1976. 15.5% exceeds the previous high, which was, I think, 12.6% in September of 1984. So we are seeing record high unemployment, and we know that 15.5%, that masks a lot of underemployment, people who are maybe still technically employed by their company, but they're not on their job site. They might or might not be receiving some subsidy, EI or the CERB, a subsidy from the federal government. So they might be receiving some support, or they might have hours that were dramatically reduced, or they might have been laid off and they're not even looking for work at the moment, simply because in their industry, they know there's no point in looking for work. And if you're not looking for work, the labor force survey, Stats Canada, does not identify you as unemployed. So that 15.5% official rate, dramatically underestimates the hit to the labor market. My guess is by the time you sum up all of those underemployed people or discouraged workers, the effective unemployment rate in Alberta is, probably above 30% at the moment. Now, we are starting to see it come down. I think May will represent the very worst of it for the unemployment rate, with the economy gradually opening back up in late May and now into June, more businesses opening gradually, people back on their jobs. I do think the unemployment rate, official and the effective unemployment rate, will both gradually start to come down. But I'm also a bit nervous about a second wave of unemployment in the fall. And this isn't really related to, the second wave of the COVID virus. We can talk about that later. But I do think we might see another wave of unemployment simply as businesses in Alberta, they might struggle through the summer. They're allowed to reopen right now, but are people really flooding back into restaurants? Are they really flooding back into the malls and the hairstylists and the fitness centers? In the service sector, which accounts for the majority of employment in Alberta, my guess is we are going to see a lot of insolvencies in businesses over the summer. So yeah, they're allowed to reopen, but they may struggle. And my guess is by fall, we might start to see a lot of those businesses, very unfortunately, closing up shop or becoming insolvent altogether. So there might be another kind of wave of unemployment because of insolvent businesses by the fall. All of this is to say, I'm not expecting that 15.5% unemployment rate, even if that's the peak in May, I'm not expecting it to come down very quickly over the summer and into the fall. And even by the end of the year, if we get even back to 10 or 11% unemployment, I would say that would be optimistic. In other words, 2020 is just going to be plain miserable for the labor market. You know, and I don't say that with any lightness, because obviously, as I said, this is very emotional for people. If they have a job or if they don't have a job, this is where the economy suddenly becomes very real for people. So 2020 is going to be difficult. But let's talk a little bit about some possible scenarios that could play out in the second half of 2020. So we're now about 3 weeks, a little less than 3 weeks away from the halfway point of the year, which is Canada Day. So what lie in store for the second half of the year? Well, I've got 4 possible scenarios related to the COVID-19 crisis and related to our response to the crisis. 4 possible scenarios that could play out. And just to make it easy for you to keep track of these 4 scenarios, I've conveniently named each scenario after a well-known animal. And the characteristic of the animal matches the characteristic of the scenario. So what are the 4 scenarios? The first one I call the koala bear scenario. Now, if any of you have had an experience with a koala bear, certainly all of you have seen photos of koalas. They are possibly the cutest creature ever to inhabit the earth. They are just adorable. And they're mostly harmless and defenseless. Now, they do have some pretty sharp claws for climbing a tree, but they are really quite defenseless animals. They are very, very timid. They're very docile animals. Now, a scenario for COVID would look like this. We respond in the second half of the year with no fear or trepidation as we would approach a koala bear. I don't know if anyone's really that terrified of a koala bear. They shouldn't be, but we respond to the virus with no concern. We relax the regulations around social and physical distancing. We maybe reopen stores and businesses a bit too quickly because the numbers seem to suggest that we should. And by July or August, you know, it's kind of like we've quit trying. We lose all fear and caution around the virus. And in fact, it turns out that's the right thing to do because a second wave of the virus fails to materialize. In other words, the COVID-19 crisis, actually that second wave, it turns out to be not dangerous at all and poses no threat for the economy. Now, I'll talk about the probabilities of each one of these scenarios at the end, but that's the first one. We approach it with no caution, and in fact, the second wave does not materialize, and it's quite benign. That's the koala bear. Scenario number 2 is the tarantula. Now, some of you, if you've seen a tarantula, or again, maybe seen a photo of a tarantula, these are terrifying looking creatures. But in fact, they are essentially harmless. Harmless to humans. They have a very mild bite and a very, very mild venom that is not going to kill any human. Apparently, and I learned all this from Google, you'd have to be bit 30 times by 30 different tarantulas at the same time to even get sick or die. So unless you're really unlucky and you fall in a pit of tarantulas, a single tarantula is harmless. And the tarantula got its scary and terrifying reputation, by the way, from Hollywood. Because when the Hollywood movie, when the scene called for a terrifying spider, they used tarantulas specifically for this reason. They look very scary and intimidating, but in fact, they pose no threat to the actors. So they're perfect for movie sets. But as a result, when we see a tarantula, most of us would run away. Economically, this scenario looks like we approach the second half of the year with a lot of caution. We keep our guards up. We maintain the physical distancing, as Dr. Hinshaw recommends. Stores and shops and businesses only gradually reopen. We are very cautious about this. But in fact, that turns out to be the wrong thing to do because the COVID-19, the second wave does not materialize. And in fact, the whole thing goes away without too much trouble at all. So that's the tarantula. The third scenario is what I call the hippopotamus scenario. Now, hippos, they are adorable looking creature. Most of you remember that TELUS ad from about a decade ago I want a hippopotamus for Christmas. And now you're going to be singing that song all afternoon. You're welcome. But yeah, that was the little jingle, because who doesn't like a hippopotamus? They're adorable looking. Except the reality is you really don't want a hippopotamus. Not for Christmas, not ever. These are very dangerous animals. They are very unpleasant. They're territorial. They will stomp you to death and rip you to shreds. But because, in fact, they look so harmless and dopey looking and cute looking, they are responsible for more human deaths than any other animal in Africa every year, because people don't approach them with enough caution. So the economic scenario looks like this. We go into the second half of the year, we drop all the caution, we stop trying, we lose our fear of the COVID virus. Stores open too quickly, sort of like with the koala. But in fact, this turns out to be the very wrong thing to do. The second wave of the virus comes with a vengeance. And because we have not been practicing social distancing, we see far more illness and death and far more damage to the economy than we have even up until now. So we get stomped to death by that hippopotamus. Scenario number 4 is the grizzly bear scenario. Now, some of you may have had an experience with a grizzly bear, but we're all taught or trained that if you are in the mountains hiking and you happen upon a grizzly bear, this is what you do. You drop everything, you look at the grizzly bear, and you very calmly and cautiously and slowly walk backward and move away from the bear. And if you do this, chances are very good that you will survive the encounter. The bear is likely to be more afraid of you than you are of it. Now, there is some danger. If you happen to be in between the bear and the bear's cub, you're a goner. These, obviously grizzlies are extremely dangerous animals, and under the right circumstances, or maybe we'd call it the wrong circumstances, you are going to be attacked by the bear. But generally speaking, if you just surprise the bear, very calmly, cautiously walk away from the bear, and you'll be unscathed. You'll only have a really good story to tell your friends later. The economic scenario in that situation is we approach the second half of the year with a lot of caution. Again, sort of like with the tarantula, we are very careful in social distancing. Stores and businesses, we follow all the rules only as we're allowed to do this. And in fact, that turns out to be the right thing to do. The second wave of the virus does not materialize. Now, there are, you might get a swipe by the grizzly bear. It might tear your tent to shreds looking for food. So we might not get out of this completely unscathed, but we are likely to get out of this alive, unlike the hippopotamus scenario. So that is, we approach it cautiously, and in fact, we do not see a multi-year recession resulting from this. So those are the 4 scenarios. Now let's talk about the probabilities. The koala bear, where we approach it with no caution and there is no reason to because it's harmless, I think that is extremely slim possibility. We've already seen the damage that the COVID crisis can do. The experts are telling us there is going to be a second wave. We don't know the timing or the intensity of it. But unless all of the epidemiologists are wrong, and they might be, but unless they're all wrong and the virus sort of just goes away, the koala bear scenario, I think, is extremely unlikely. The tarantula scenario, I think, is also unlikely. But we do seem to be, approaching the second half of the year, keeping our guards up. Canadians probably a little easier to convince that we've got to do this than maybe our American friends who are just saying, to heck with all of these rules. So we are approaching it with caution. But again, I don't think it's very likely because the tarantula is harmless, and I don't think the second wave, we can assume it's going to be harmless. The hippopotamus scenario, that is a little bit more probable. And that is if we, quickly lose our caution, we run into the summertime and we forget to do all of these things. We're just fed up and we stop trying. That is where there is a possibility we could see the hippopotamus and the second wave of the virus attack with much more ferocity than the first wave. But I think the likeliest scenario is that grizzly bear scenario. And I don't at all mean to downplay the danger of this. Everyone knows a grizzly bear is an extremely dangerous and lethal animal. But if we approach it properly, we take all of the precautions like we seem to be doing, I think chances are pretty good that we are going to get out of this alive, and that in 2021, our economy does see some rebound. So those are the four scenarios. I think the grizzly bear scenario is the likeliest. But let's talk a little bit about then 2021. And how much time do I have? I better wrap up here pretty quick. 2021, we are forecasting a modest rebound, maybe around 2 or 3%. We do not buy into the conference boards, and I don't want to pick on them specifically, but the conference board, they're calling for a downturn this year of about 5.5%, but a rebound next year of 6.8%, or thereabouts. I have a hard time buying this very sharp V-shaped recovery in Alberta for the fact that oil prices, I'm not convinced those are going to rebound very quickly. And that is really what we would need in Alberta to see a 6% growth next year, is we would need a very strong recovery in oil prices. And as a result, we would see a very strong rebound in capital investment and activity in our energy sector. I'm not convinced we're going to see it. I think oil prices are going to be very slow to recover. Lots of questions, it's a global supply of oil is a question. Can we really count on Saudi Arabia and Russia with their withholding of production? I would not say that as a very solid promise from those two countries. On the demand side, are we going to see global demand rebound to pre-COVID levels? I'm not convinced of that either. Just look at the aviation industry globally. They are saying, all of them are saying this is going to be a 3 or 4 year recovery for aviation. And more of us, we're all going to get back in our cars and drive around, but I don't think we are going to drive as much. I think more and more people, not everyone, but more and more people are going to understand, yeah, actually, I can get a lot of work done from home. I'm used to doing this now. I don't need to sit in rush hour traffic twice a day to get in and out of a downtown core. We're talking globally. So I'm not convinced global oil demand is going to rebound in 2021. And then there's also a question of storage. Still a lot of supply sitting in storage in the US on tanker ships bobbing around the ocean and globally. So all of that is to say, I think we are going to see a grizzly bear recovery or a grizzly bear scenario, a lot of danger. We take the cautions. 2020 is by far the worst year, but we get out of it unscathed with a modest rebound in 2021. Okay, so we're at 1:40. So I want to stop talking now, and I want to turn it over to all of you to ask whatever questions you want. And hopefully I can answer.
Thank you, Todd. That was awesome. Yeah, you gave us a lot of material. I've written 3 pages down of notes from your talk. So I'm just thinking of things to ask. And just for our audience, on the side there is a chat box there that you can click. I would just ask if you just write your name down, and then I'll turn it to you so that we can go through kind of in an orderly fashion. But I know first, Christopher Steves, you wrote your question out, so I'll read it and then I'll turn it over to you, Chris, to elaborate. But Chris wrote down, since we won't see a similar result as the Great Depression, should we be expecting a similar impact as the worldwide depression in 08-09? And does that experience better prepare us for it? And Chris Steves, if you want to elaborate on that at all, but there's the first question for you.
Chris, did you want to add to that, or I can sort of...
if you need some more detail around it, I can provide a little more detail, but if you feel comfortable with it.
Yeah. The global downturn of 2008, 2009 is probably the closest thing we have to compare with, at least in terms of this is a global situation. It's a global recession, but the two are very different. The global financial crisis of 08-09, that was triggered by problems in the US housing market, which then spilled over into global credit markets and the credit markets seizing up. And that took a long time for it to kind of work its way out, especially in the US. That was a very U-shaped recovery for them. This pandemic, while there are some comparisons, the big difference is, this is the language of an economist, this is an endogenous shock, or pardon me, exogenous. This is something from totally outside the system. This is kind of like a meteorite hitting the earth. This is something that the virus itself is something that was not triggered by a problem systemic in the financial markets. So because of that, it is different. I think the timeline of recovery is going to be different. There are more unknowns, especially around that second wave of the virus and how other countries around the world, how they respond to it. And until there is really a vaccine in place, we are going to see lingering effects of this. So while there are some similarities, I don't think government response to it is necessarily, what worked in 08, 09 is not necessarily going to work in 2020 and 2021. This is a very different economic problem that's been created.
Thanks, Todd.
I appreciate that.
Next, Patrick, you have a question. Go for it.
Yeah, Todd, I was wondering, do you see in sort of a recovery anything similar to what happened 100 years ago with the Spanish flu? Like, we seem to have a massive upsurge in innovation and societal change after the pandemic. Was it the war or was it the pandemic?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I'm sure lots of scholars and, people way smarter than me, they've been studying it. I think what made 1918, the Spanish flu, is probably the closest comparison we have in terms of a pandemic. This is a virus that sort of comes out of nowhere and it wipes out, a lot of people or causes a major health crisis. But it also happened during the First World War. So there were other things going on, and then coming out of the First World War in 1919, I think that alone gave, the global economy a lift. So that makes it hard to compare. The other thing that really makes it hard to compare is that it was 102 years ago. So people did not travel as much as they travel today. In fact, one of the reasons they believe that the Spanish flu was as damaging as it was is because the only people traveling in 1918, you had a lot of soldiers moving around Europe and back and forth between North America, which you wouldn't have seen before. You would not have seen that kind of mobility of people, but it was soldiers at the time. Today, pre-COVID, people fly all over the world all the time for, $1,000. And that is what really, helped spread the COVID-19 virus in 2020. And now, of course, we're seeing, very limited travel. So there's comparisons with 1918, but I think they're really limited. You sort of referred to, there were some changes in consumer behavior and maybe some innovations. I think that is instructive to look at, because when we look at COVID-19 in 2020, one of the big questions that hangs over us is, will consumers just go back to life as normal, as if nothing happened, maybe when the vaccine arrives, or are there going to be some permanent changes in the way we interact, in the way we, go to sporting events, in the way we eat at restaurants? Are there going to be some permanent changes? There is evidence from 1918 that, in fact, humans do make changes, and those changes can be permanent. I'll be quick with this story. Maybe some of you heard it. Back pre-Spanish flu, train transportation, that was really the only way you could get around the continent. So when people were on trains, every train car, apparently, had a big, sort of a big drum of water, drinking water, that was for the people on the train to drink. But tied underneath the drum was a copper cup. And everyone used the same cup. It just hung there, and you fill up the cup with water, and then the next person uses it. That just seemed like, a normal thing to do. After the Spanish flu, that went away forever. No one ever did that again. So that's one very small example of something that was really common that never, ever came back. When we think about 2020, are we going to go back to the all-you-can-eat salad bar buffets? This is pre-COVID, this was pretty common. We all sort of did this. I get invited to speak at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and almost always it's a buffet lunch. Are we going back to that, or do even simple things like that go away? Are we going to the all-inclusive resorts in Mexico? Are we piling ourselves on airplanes? Even local transportation, are people going to get on, pile onto the C train at rush hour like they used to? Or might they say, I'm not going downtown, or if I am, I'm going to take my car. I think we will see some permanent changes in consumer attitudes and behavior. Some of them might be surprising, but I think that is one thing we can expect.
Thanks, Todd. I have a couple questions, but I just have a little bit of a preamble. So, Todd, I appreciate you were talking about the first part of your talk was really discussing the two, I guess, interventions that really assisted in not really mimicking the Great Depression. So one being governments providing immediate relief funds, really like acting on that. And we've seen that around quite a bit and on the news. And then the central banks having responded. So making sure there is liquidity there. And then the second part of your talk, you were going into the 4 scenarios. So really the koala, the tarantula, the hippo, and the grizzly, and what's most likely. And in there, it's kind of like peppered with a lot of private interventions that people, businesses, etc., can do. So you have both the public and the private. What side of it, the public interventions or the private interventions, would really result in us maybe not going down the path of a grizzly bear and maybe going down the path of, I guess, the koala or the tarantula? So, because we had the government intervention and the private. So 2 major players here. So who carries the most weight?
Well, that's an interesting question. It's a good question. I mean, government can give their directives on these things, but if private individuals and businesses, businesses, I guess, could be fined, but, if private individuals, if we don't follow those guidelines and those restrictions and limitations, none of the government, restrictions are going to make any difference. I think in Canada, maybe I'm wrong on this, maybe it's a generalization, but I think in Canada, for the most part, we're more willing to, generally pretty willing to follow, okay, the government is saying this. We might, cheat a little bit here and there, and we shouldn't. But I think for the most part, private individuals will follow that. There used to be this really great joke. How do you get 50 Canadians out of a swimming pool? You say, everyone get out of the swimming pool, and we're gonna do it, because generally we're a pretty compliant. We go along with what we're told to do. There might be some drawbacks to that, but in this case, I think we will see a fairly high level of adherence to it. I might be wrong on that. It might get to be July and people say, especially once, say here in Alberta, once we start to get down to, maybe single digit, every day we listen to Dr. Hinshaw and there was 20 new cases or 40 new cases and 6 new deaths or whatever. Once those numbers kind of fall down to close to 0, even if the government does not lighten up on the restrictions, we might just say, this thing's over. I already hear some people saying that, it's time to get back to, and it is, I think, time to start gradually turning the dimmer switch on. We have to get businesses open eventually, and people do need to get their lives back. But I think we will, I don't know if I'm answering your question very well, but I think we will see the private response in accord with what the government directives are, mostly in accord with it.
Thanks. Thank you for that. Next, there's a question from Haley from the Strathmore Wheatland Chamber. Haley wrote it down, but Haley, I'll turn it to you if you'd like to just ask it and maybe expand on it if you'd like.
Thanks, Matthew. Yeah, it's from something that Todd had shared earlier about the idea of there is a lot of government spending going on right now, which we need. We all know that. What's that going to look like in the next year, in the next 5 years, as we move into the next phase and beyond? How do we recover from that? Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Also a really great question. And here too, I mean, there is a lot of guesswork involved. But I think the likeliest scenario is that over the summer and into the fall, we are going to see especially a lot of the federal programs, you know, the big, massive ones, the CERB, the EI program. They all have, you know, these acronyms, the ones for businesses, the ones for farmers. You know, I think we will see those taper off. In fact, CERB, which I believe is in terms of dollars, is the largest program. I think already that's expected to be winding down into July, I believe. You know, that's only 7 weeks away. And that might leave some people in a lurch, and the government may decide to extend it a month or two. I don't know. But I think for the most part, over the second half of the year, we will see those massive government support programs taper off. Some of the ones maybe at the provincial government level or municipal government level, depending on the situation, maybe especially around businesses reopening, we might see those a little bit longer. But for the most part, by the end of 2020, barring some hippopotamus kind of scenario where the wave comes back even worse, you know, and we have to hold that out there. That is a possibility, but I don't think it's the likeliest case. But barring that, you know, massive second wave, I think by the end of the year, we will see most of those government support programs taper off and you know, be eliminated or terminated by the end of the year, which in 2021, assuming we see some modest recovery, the government isn't going to have to, you know, engage in that massive spending all over again.
Thanks, Todd. Just out of curiosity, I'll just ask one, and I think Patrick has a follow-up here. Just because some of us work in local government, what are the best interventions that local government can provide their constituents?
That is a great question. And it might, you know, it really might vary from municipality to municipality, depending on how hard they're hit. For example, I mean, and I don't know if Wheatland County is necessary. My guess is you would be sort of middle of the road, but those counties or those municipalities that are heavily exposed to the energy sector, it's going to be harder on them. You know, I'm thinking counties like Lac La Biche or Cold Lake or Fort McMurray, you know. Now there is, you know, most parts of the province have some oil and gas, some have very little. I mean, Lethbridge, there's very little at all. So depending on the industrial mix, I think the response or the economic impact is gonna vary. But the most important thing, I don't know. I mean, supporting those local businesses in whatever way you can, if that means perhaps some extension of business fees or licenses, maybe a program designed around encouraging more community support of those local businesses. I mean, there's kind of soft things that you can do that don't necessarily come down to tax policy that you can do to help encourage those businesses. But it's going to be difficult. So I don't know if I have, in fact, I know I don't have, you know, here's the prescriptive measures that everyone has to take. But really helping those local businesses, I think is the single biggest thing you're going to be able to do to help.
Thank you. Over to you, Patrick.
Okay. I'm gonna try to simplify what's going through my head on a question, but I'm wondering, Todd, how you see just the way that the pandemic has sort of rolled out, how we've seen potentially issues of realization have vulnerability of our supply chains and stuff like that. But I'm wondering, like, coming, you know, where we're kind of going and which animal, a lot of I guess the developed world has migrated to urban areas. So knowing that Ontario and Quebec still have their challenges with the pandemic, and then BC's kind of coming out with Alberta and the rest of the Western provinces, do you see anything that could align to an animal a little bit more than the grizzly based on what's unfolding in different rates? Like we saw Calgary and Brooks open later, and that would affect, you know, like even with Calgary and Edmonton, we're hearing of massive amounts of vacancies in the downtowns, like the sort of the hubs of each of these cities. Yeah, did you have anything that you can sort of throw all that into an answer?
Well, it sounds like maybe the question has to do with, you know, the impact on urban versus more rural parts of the province and the country. And you're right, it's not uniform. I know in Ontario, especially, there's a lot of kind of frustration because almost all the cases in Ontario or in Toronto, and that makes sense. I mean, you've got 5 million people kind of packed into, you know, pretty dense. Whereas, you know, places up in Northern Ontario, they've seen very few cases, if any. Yet they're all following, you know, they're expected to follow all the same provincial edicts on, you know, reopening and everything like that. And here too in Alberta, barring the situation, you know, with High River and, you know, the meat packer there, and I guess Brooks, you know, those are, I think, exceptional situations. But abstracting away from that, rural Alberta has not seen nearly as many cases as Calgary and Edmonton, you know, for the same reasons. That may sort of play into the favor of more rural areas, even if their businesses maybe aren't allowed to open as quickly. I think it maybe gives them the advantage, you know, once there are no cases in rural Alberta, you know, reopening of those businesses and relaxing some of those rules, people might just feel more confident going back to restaurants and local shops and local businesses. Whereas Calgary, Edmonton, you know, Montreal, are they going to feel as much? And what might that mean for those businesses in those urban areas? The rural areas, my guess is we won't see consumer confidence shaken to the same degree. And that might be the biggest advantage for those rural regions. Does that come anywhere close to answering?
Yep, it does. And then I guess the first half I started with was the exposure of the threat to our supply chains.
Yeah.
Opportunities, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, a previous presentation I used to be giving, I ended, you know, talking about some opportunities, and we can get into those. But one of them for sure is on more locally produced and procured goods and services, especially in agri-foods, but not limited to agri-foods. Agri-foods in Alberta, I mean, this has already been on a nice upswing for the last decade or more. And I think coming out of COVID, we're going to see an even bigger jump in locally produced food and beverage. I think the premium that consumers already put on local is going to increase even more. And in those non-food things, you know, manufacturers, for example, that they relied on these global supply chains. But now we've seen, in fact, how brittle and fragile those supply chains can be. And it's not that we're going to, you know, replicate China and all of a sudden turn to mass manufacturing, not at all. But I do think that to the extent possible, even if it comes with maybe a little bit of a higher price, I think local manufacturers will take a harder look. Can I procure this widget or this component or whatever it is? Can I procure that locally or at least domestically? Even if it's a higher price, there's a lower risk associated with that supply chain now being disrupted. So I do think it's a good opportunity for locally produced agri-foods especially, but also a broader array of manufactured goods coming out of COVID because of the fragility of those global supply chains.
Thank you, Todd. We have another question here from Marcus, so I'll read it out. In recessions, there is a focus on kickstarting the economy via infrastructure programs. Will the federal provincial government embrace this opportunity to diversify our economy and implement a new age energy policy? Yesterday, Tina Brew, Norway's Minister for Petroleum Energy, said this: "What we have done in Norway is a gigantic paradox. Giving incentives to have this amazing growth in electrification is a clear policy for removing the need of our main export product, which is oil and gas, but is the right thing to do."
Wow. Yeah. Well, that's a whole 2-day conference talking government infrastructure, and the question sort of sneaks its way into carbon, the global demand for carbon and everything else. And Norway, of course, has been in the news quite a lot lately, especially for their sovereign wealth fund sort of blacklisting Canadian oil sand companies. I think a bit unfairly. But I guess the point Norway is trying to make is, even though we've become ridiculously wealthy on the back of hydrocarbons, it's now time, in Norway's mind, it's time for them to move on to something else that perhaps does not have the same environmental impact. Alberta, I think we need to do both. I think we need to support our energy industry 100%. But at the same time, we have to recognize the global economy. They have a very conflicted relationship at the moment with hydrocarbons. COVID doesn't, I don't think, change that. And what I mean by conflicted is, people want to protest pipelines and they want to protest carbon emissions, but they want to drive their car to the protest and they want to fly their airplane to the protest. And, the irony of this has not been lost on Albertans. And we can stomp our feet and say this is unfair, but life is often unfair. I don't go so far as calling hydrocarbons a sunset industry. I think that's loaded with a lot of negativity, but I do suggest that peak oil demand, we may have already seen it, by the way. COVID has changed that global oil demand profile. It may never bounce back to pre-COVID levels. And even if it does, I would expect that global oil demand is going to peak. Everyone believes this. Even, Chevron Mobile, they expect that by the year 2060, which isn't that long from now anymore, and they're, by the way, the furthest ones out. Most people predict peak oil demand globally is going to happen probably in the next 5 to 10 years. So all this means is that, we need to support our hydrocarbon industry, but like Nora, we need to recognize that is not where the future is going to be for this province. And we do need to add to the diversity of our energy sector, not abandon oil and gas, but we can't just have this single-minded focus on oil and gas as well.
Thanks for that, Todd. Are there any other questions that anyone has while we have Todd here? I know you said you have until about 3 p.m., right?
Yeah. Well, I've got another meeting at 3, but
yeah,
we're actually at 2:45, but I'm okay for certainly for the time being, as long as there's questions.
Perfect. We don't have any coming in right now. I think I have, just going through, you had closed your talk on the 2021 forecasting models, I guess a modest rebound of 2.3%, and ATB, I guess, taking the position you're kind of at odds with the conference board's projections. Is that strictly, I know you had said in Alberta it's really related to the oil sector, or commodity, right? Is there any other kind of elements related to that kind of, you guys made your statement, or you kind of put that forward? Are there any other elements that you can expand on?
Well, and I should clarify, we haven't, I can talk about, our forecast. I don't want to be so clandestine about it, but we actually have not taken the step to issue a press release like the conference board did and say, here is our pinpoint forecast. Only because I think it's ridiculous. With so many unknowns, it's just ridiculous to try to guess to 1/10 of a percentage point. Like economists, we have this big ego, even in normal times, that we think we can do this. And now with COVID, with all of these enormous questions, we just really don't know. But broadly speaking, I would say nasty recession this year, unprecedented decline in our economy this year, with a modest rebound, if it's 1%, if it's 2% next year. Most of that is predicated on our belief that we are not expecting a V-shaped recovery in global oil demand. And I think that's the only way you're going to get, and I've read the conference board's forecast. I haven't gone so far as to actually, get on the phone and talk with them. Maybe I should. But, they are expecting more of this, global oil demand is going to recover. And as a result, so will Alberta's energy industry. It'll be back to sort of business as usual. It could happen. I mean, maybe I'm hopeful that happens, but I'm not putting my money on that. I just don't see, you know, that said, I mean, we have seen oil prices rebound from negative, what was it, $37 that one day in April. We have seen kind of a nice little rebound. These days, that West Texas price is, you know, a little bit below 40 bucks, but I'll be honest, you know, that was a little bit of a stronger recovery than I was expecting this quickly. But I don't know, something just in the gut of my stomach tells me, or the pit of my stomach tells me, that globally, we are not going to see oil prices, oil demand recover to pre-COVID levels this year, or probably not even next year. And that's mostly what's behind our much more modest forecast for Alberta next year.
Thank you. Any other questions to the group? Hearing none. Todd, do you have any closing remarks before we move on with our agenda?
Well, maybe the one comment that I'll leave you with, or maybe just something to think about. I've been reading a book over the COVID days called The Third Pillar, and the subtitle is How Markets and Government Leave Community Behind. And this is written by an economist. I forget the gentleman's name, but he used to be the head of the International Monetary Fund. He teaches economics at the University of Chicago Business School. So this is an economist through and through. But he makes the point that, you know, in the 20th century, most of the debate that we would have, you know, around ideological debate is it should be more market-driven, more capitalism, you know, or should it be more government-driven and more state-driven? And that kind of marked the 20th century, this push and pull between the market and government. And he makes the point, the author of the book makes the point, we need capitalism, we need the market system. But when it becomes over-dominant, bad things start to happen. We start to see income disparity. We start to see, you know, the rich getting richer and the poor left behind, and some other negative things around it, environmental degradation. So we need the market, but it can't become too dominant. In the same token, we need government. Our whole market system, in fact, is based on rule of law. It's based on order. It's based on everyone knows the rules here. But when government, too, becomes too dominant, bad things tend to happen. We saw what happened, you know, with communism and that failed sort of attempt where government was the only pillar. But he makes the point now now this book came out in 2019. I would love to talk to this author to see if any of his thinking has changed over COVID. My guess is he's probably even more convinced of his argument. But he makes the point that the third leg of the stool, the one that gets left behind, is community. How and whatever community means. I mean, that can mean a geographic neighborhood where you live. It might mean a business community, you know, like a chamber of commerce. It might mean a faith community, a sports community. It can mean any number of different things. But relying more on community connections, this is the third leg of the stool. And you need all three of these, the market, government, and community in balance. And my hope is that over COVID and coming out of COVID, you know, later this year in 2021, that all of us will perhaps re-energize our own ideas of what community means. This might be where smaller centers like Strathmore might have a leg up on a bigger community like Calgary, especially over the summer. No one's traveling anywhere. This might be a fantastic opportunity for people to rediscover, or maybe discover for the first time, what community means for them, what it means for their businesses, how strengthening community can bring market economy and government into balance. So I'd just like to leave you with that, because I think it's an encouraging idea, an encouraging way to think about maybe one of the benefits that can come out of COVID is how do we reimagine and re-energize our ideas of what community is. So with that, I hope, encouraging note, I want to thank you so much for the opportunity. I've gone over over my time that I think I was allotted, but wonderful to be with you virtually. I hope you all have a wonderful summer. I hope you all stay well and take care of each other.
Thank you so much, Todd, for joining us. On behalf of Wheatland County, we really appreciate it. You are more than welcome to stay for the rest of the agenda as we go through our business roundtable, but feel free. But we really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
You too. And for everyone else, we're going through pretty much the business roundtable, whereby we'll just go down through all of our participants who are here, talk about what's been going on the last week, any updates in terms of what they've been doing, any news that they've heard throughout the community. So with that being said, the first on my list here is BJ. BJ, if you want to unmute and just provide a quick update to the group here.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. It's been a great week. It seems like the visitors to Rosebud this past Saturday sort of exploded. It took us a little bit by surprise here at the market because it wasn't people coming for the market necessarily. People were just driving by and saw action and wanted to be part of it. So it was really cool. I gave many tours of the inn. I was just so pleased to be able to do it. And I was a bit late to the call because two groups showed up right at 5 to 1. One wanted to sit out on our deck and have pie and a cup of tea, and others wanted to show me maps and things of the area and ask directions. So, I mean, it is starting to move. I'm thrilled to death that the Rosebud Mercantile is choosing to open their patio. That announcement came out yesterday, and that will really provide a space for people to come and have a little something to eat and just enjoy each other's company. They're going to practice all the safe distancing, all that. But the fact that that is there where people can sit and just chat it up, especially all the motorcyclists coming through, I think it's brilliant. And it's about time. So I'm really, really pleased for that. And yeah, great orders this week for the market. It's all positive from this end. So just wanted to let you know that.
That's great, BJ. Are there any comments or questions for BJ before we move forward? Carolyn, you're up next. Thank you for joining us. I think you are on mute.
Yes, I am. And can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. I don't actually have any real updates from Ministry of Labor and Immigration, but I'm always curious to hear how things are going with employers around, now we're moving into another phase of reopening. Are people getting the PPE and all the stuff they need to be open? Are there any challenges? Once again, I always just like to take any labor market information that I can gather to my bi-weekly report. And so I'm curious if anybody's got anything they'd like me to communicate up the chain, or if there's any challenges that you're facing that you need some government input on, that kind of thing.
I'll open it up to the floor here if anyone has any comments on that.
I do, Matt.
Sure, go for it, Pat.
Carolyn, I'm wondering, because I heard reports today on the masks that they're giving out at fast food joints that they're being just dumped onto people. Is there anything that you've heard perhaps that we can get that PPE to businesses besides the fast food? Like, is there a distribution thing you've heard out of the province? It might be hard out of your ministry, but I'm just wondering.
Yeah, it is kind of outside of our ministry, but I know that they have arrangements with those fast food places, and you're wondering if more businesses could have access to that?
Yeah, like I understand they picked that sector to dump the first 20 million, but I'm wondering for the next 20 million that's available with the province, if there's an idea that perhaps it can be dispersed, I don't know, just through a different mechanism, because there are businesses that have talked about the price of PPE, the availability of it as we were still in phase one or stage one, that I don't know.
Well, so you're asking if it could be distributed in a different way in the next kind of phase of distribution?
Yeah, like I'm thinking perhaps it could be dispersed through maybe regional chambers or municipalities, even that businesses can come like to some sort of conduit where that people wouldn't be given full bags of masks just to get them out of out of the restaurants kind of thing.
Well, that's something that I can certainly relay. I can relay that suggestion.
Yeah, and well, in the labor side, it's for me. I'm thinking, there is these businesses are reopening. Some people are concerned about going back to work for risk, for health risks and stuff like that. That perhaps the availability of this PPE that they're looking to distribute, that it could come to the businesses a little bit more direct.
Definitely. I'm writing notes as you speak here.
Okay. That's all I have.
Okay. Yeah, I wish I could answer these questions, but I can only relay information, really. Sorry to say.
Not a problem.
Thanks, Patrick. Anybody else have any comments? Chris Steves, you are up next.
Just a small reminder for everyone out there, we've been still working on the regional recovery and relief program here, and we just encourage everyone that you're speaking to, small business owners, to make sure that they're evaluating where they're at with their business, and if it is something that they require, that they get their application in. Right now on Friday, we will be at the 3-week mark for it, and we're coming up on about half of the money that's been allocated to us. So it's not going to hang around for a long period of time, and it is a valuable tool. But I will also say this from speaking to people that have reached out to us, a lot of people haven't looked at other opportunities as well, whether it be in the agricultural industry or in the service industry. So the awareness is still lacking a little bit, so we have reached out and tried to disseminate our information to different groups to get it out to their people. So I believe it will help, but it always helps to have more voices with us. So that's it for myself, and that's the key thing that I'm working on right now.
Thank you, Chris. Are there any questions? Up next, I have Evan, if you're still there.
Yes, I am there. You guys see me? Yeah, I don't really have an update, I guess. I mean, it's kind of business as usual. I feel like the vibe around town and the area has been generally getting more positive. People are feeling like their jobs and income is going to be more secure. So yeah, me and my brokerage have been busy just helping out families and whatnot. So yeah, that's about really all I have. Just in general, it seems like everyone's kind of getting more optimistic. So that's it for me.
Right on. Thanks, Evan. Haley, are you still there?
Yes, that was a delay. Sorry, Pat, about that, Matthew.
No problem.
I'm still here, and I'm going to copy what Evan was just commenting on. There's definitely a more positive vibe going on around the area, businesses that I've been talking to. One of the things that we have worked on in the last couple of weeks is a public service announcement about how businesses are opening up and what they're doing to keep the public safe. And we created one video already around that, and we've been passing it along social media. And Patrick and I are going to be busy in the next couple of weeks also getting out to the Wheatland businesses and creating something similar. And every single business owner I've talked to have been very positive about what's been happening and how the public is receiving them, and how conscious they are about making sure that the public is safe. And it's really neat to see how they've been rallying. Yeah, that's kind of the synop right now.
Thank you, Haley. Any questions for Haley on behalf of the chamber?
I have one. I just want to know, Haley, about the t-shirts. This is BJ.
Yeah. Hi, BJ. BJ and I were talking yesterday, and one of the campaigns that we've been working on is I Choose Hope. And BJ had a fantastic idea about us creating t-shirts. So BJ, I've been in contact with one of our resources in Strathmore about creating some of these t-shirts, and there's definitely more to come in that. Yeah. So thank you for that idea.
Oh, it's fantastic. I think that if the idea was that if all employers could have their employees wearing those t-shirts, not only could we sell more of them to spread the word, but it would also unify. It would be a great unification thing between the Chamber of Strathmore and Wheatland County. It would bring us all together. And I just thought that would be a great idea, because I loved that. I Choose Hope, Rediscover Local. I just thought that was brilliant. And I look forward to seeing what comes, Haley.
Right on, BJ. You are so right. We always need to have an idea of how we can continue to connect our region. And I think that's a great idea.
Good. Great.
Excellent. That sounds awesome, Haley. So keep us posted. I'm sure Patrick will be a part of the conversation. Jacqueline. I think you're on mute here.
She has no mic or video.
Okay.
Yep.
I will move to Paul.
Hi. Thanks, Matthew. Well, like BJ said, things are hopping here in Rosebud on the weekends, which is really exciting. And yeah, not a whole lot new to report this week, except that you know what I'm gonna do? I'm even gonna put, I think this this link should work, hopefully. That link is to the menu for this weekend's takeaway meals at the Merc. Chef Mo has got a couple of new entrees this weekend, a beef vindaloo and also a fried chicken dinner. And they both look amazing. So yeah, so that's happening Friday and Saturday from 12 to 5. You can either just show up and put in your order, and it'll come out for you, or if you want to, you can phone ahead and put your order in by phoning 677-3000 and extension 236, and that'll get you through to the kitchen, and they'll take your order and have it ready for you when you come. So yeah, it is exciting to see all the people in town on the weekends. I'll say as well that we are talking about other events and things that we can do for the summer. We're considering, you know, we have an outdoor stage next to the Opera House, and we're considering things like certain kinds of concerts. I know that singing concerts aren't really allowed right now, but instrumental concerts are. So we're talking with the Rosebud Chamber Music Festival about ways we could partner with them to potentially do some outdoor concerts on the weekends. So that's pretty exciting. And I will say this too, just because I'm, you know, not to beat the drum too much, but I'm going to beat the drum. rosebudtheater.com/support us. If you haven't looked at the Rosebud documentary, please do. If you haven't shared it, please do. And I have to say the response to that little documentary has been amazing, both from the point of view of just people reacting to the gorgeous little film that it is, but also then responding with their dollars. It's been really gratifying. And then, of course, coming up tomorrow at noon, we've got our homestage tour. So tune in on the Facebook page at noon tomorrow for another live concert. And I think that's about it.
Sounds great, Paul. I think you're making everybody hungry right there. So maybe we'll try to adjourn this quicker. I think, Tanis, you are up next.
Hi, sorry, I was slow on the unmute.
No problem.
Yeah, I guess a quick update about open farm days. Our loose soft deadline for farms for registering is the end of June. Where we're sitting right now, we're significantly behind where we've been in the past. So last year we had about 160 farms. Right now we have about 60 registered, which is understandable. So again, if there's people in your community that you want to encourage to sign up, it's probably a great year for it. We know a lot of people are interested in getting out, so we expect some positive responses. So yeah, so if I can just put that out there. Also, what we're seeing is an increase in sort of trails and people looking for where can I go and are there loops and where can I go and buy direct. So we're directing people from the Open Farm Day sites to farm gates. So if you have farms in the region that haven't signed up, it's just a great place for them to be able to connect with consumers that want to go to the farms and buy directly. So just strongly encourage that, and we'll see where this all goes. We have had a few farms cancel with concerns, and we don't know where that's kind of going to go. And I think it comes down to each individual and their comfort level with what's going on.
Thanks for the update, Tanis. Are there any questions on that?
Okay.
And I can't go any further without noticing we have a few development services staff in this conversation for the county. We have Cindy Ramsey, our safety codes technician. Graham Allison is in, he's planner 1. And I think we have Suzanne Hayes, who's our development officer. So these fine folks deal with are on the front lines essentially with our planning development approvals processes at the county. So many of you may be familiar, but they're here to assist you in any of that whole planning realm aspects, components that you may have, fielding questions and concerns. So do any of you three have any comments? I'm hoping one does. Never mind. Okay, well, they're listening anyways, but nonetheless, just had to give a shout out to them. So thanks for being here, guys. Before we adjourn, I just want to turn it back over to Councillor Bigger. I know you're in the conversation here, so do you have any closing remarks? And Donna, you may be on mute. Reeve Link, are you there?
I can just say thank you to everybody on behalf of Wheatland County Council. Want to thank everybody. It's been good collaboration. It was excellent hearing Todd and all of his insights, and thanks everybody for joining us today.
Thank you, Reeve Link. Patrick, any updates on your end before we adjourn?
So we're still under development for the WC Mercantile on the Infinite WC site. The Infinite WC site has a new homepage. It's got a different layout as we implement our crowd riff into it. And I wanted to bring up too that we were also in Rosebud, myself and Wendy from Community Futures on Tuesday. And we had a really good meeting with a few of the organizing people with some groups in Rosebud to work on strategies, linking events, collaboration amongst the different groups within the and associations within Rosebud. We had a meeting with BJ as well to talk about some things in strategies and development. So that was good. And it was great having pecan pie. I'll bring that up. And yeah, so for next week, definitely preparing to get into, I'm hosting a session with the Business Retention and Expansion International AGM and conference, talking about collaboration and communication during COVID, and sharing some of the things that we do here in the county. So that's pretty exciting. And yeah, other than that, yeah, just things are clicking along.
Thank you, Patrick. Does anybody have any questions for the county before we sign off? Excellent. Well, we hope to see you guys next week. Patrick will send out an invite for next week's call, but we hope you all have a great weekend. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Thank you.
Is now exiting.